Did you know that 33 million teen vapers globally think that because e-cigarettes don't cause cancer, like conventional cigarettes, they must be all good? By conveying the hazards of nicotine vaping as 5-minute short stories or microlearning, and spoken in the simplest language possible, Safeguard is about youth, for youth, and in the language of youth, Teen Vaping Awareness Mission. So, what are you waiting for? Listen, learn, quit.
Hello everyone, my name is Ayan Shadri and today I'm here to present you the mission Safeguard, a microlearning platform all about teen vaping. So Safeguard is a 9-letter acronym, and thus we begin with the first letter, S, as this is a 9-video microlearning series. And the S stands for the story of cigarettes, their history and their origin. I'll give you some insight into why I created this microlearning series, as well as going all the way back 500 years of the cigarette use epidemic, from Christopher Columbus in 1492 all the way to the 21st century. And lastly, we'll discuss the 2003 invention of the e-cigarette in China and its pros and cons. So how this microlearning series came to be. Last year I had the unique opportunity, to intern at the world's first vaping cessation company, Achieve Life Sciences. And they create a product known as cytisinicline, which is a medicine focused on vaping cessation or allowing users to stop vaping. And in my time with them, I had the opportunity to write a paper about vaping specifically in teens, during which time I learned that scientific research is often phrased in a highly sophisticated and elevated way, often shutting out the common man or woman themselves who wants to read the paper and understand the science. And thus, I thought that I should be the one to simplify some of this teen vaping research down to a simpler level, so that if we're doing research about the teens, we should be able to talk directly to the teens. What point is it doing this research if it's phrased in a way that the teen themselves can't understand it? So now I'm going to go all the way back to 6000 BC and discuss the history of vaping. And why do we need to go all the way this back, you may ask? That's because our present is impacted by our past. And that's why we're going to go all the way back to the history of smoking first. In 6000 BC, a plant called Nicotiana tabacum, or modern-day tobacco, is grown in the Americas. And as we know from our history classes, in 1492, Christopher Columbus arrives in modern-day Haiti, and he finds tobacco growing abundantly in Hispaniola, where he is, and it's been growing there for over 8,000 years. And it's a very ritualistic item for the community in Hispaniola. It's offered to the gods during religious ceremonies and whatnot. And then in the 1500s, Columbus receives a gift of tobacco leaves from the locals in Hispaniola, and his crewmen Rodrigo Gutierrez and Luis de Torres start smoking tobacco with the natives and realize its unique euphorogenic properties, meaning that it can create strong yet short-lived feelings of joy. And thus they bring it back to Spain with them, and this is a significant part of the Columbian exchange, which I'm sure we have discussed in our history classes as well, the interchange between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia, and tobacco was actually a very significant part of this Columbian exchange. And in the mid-1500s, it becomes a highly profitable cash crop in Europe, meaning that it's a big money maker. And then in 1636, Estanco de Tabaco on España, a Spanish company, becomes the first company globally to sell commercially tobacco. And now we're going to discuss the creation of big tobacco, which are the large tobacco conglomerates that sort of monopolize both smoking and vaping in the modern world. In 1760, Lorillard in New York City became the first U.S. commercial tobacco seller, and they introduced a roll-your-own cigarette product similar to the one we have today, and you can see some of Lorillard's packaging over here. And then in 1847, Philip Morris, whose packaging you can see here, the world's largest cigarette company, is established, selling roll-your-own cigarettes with tobacco imported from Turkey. And then in 1860, the Industrial Revolution, as I'm sure we know of, allowed for many products to be automated and made at a much quicker rate, and cigarettes were no different. The invention of the cigarette-making machine by James Bonsack in 1881, who partners up with a new company called the American Tobacco Company. And you can see here Bonsack's cigarette machine. And with this invention, the ATC can now produce 200 cigarettes per minute at a very mass-produced, rapid rate. And today, Philip Morris and the ATC, now called the British American Tobacco Company, are the two biggest cigarette makers in the world, part of Big Tobacco. So now we're going to discuss some research having to do with smoking, and then eventually the creation of the vape. In 1610, Sir Francis Bacon of England first noted the addictive nature of tobacco, and he called it a habit hard to kick, a pretty Gen Z thing to say. And then in the 17th century, the Chinese philosopher Fang Yishi pointed out the dangers of smoking, causing scorched lungs. And then in 1938, the first epidemiological papers, meaning that they focused on the causes of disease, by U.S. biostatistician Raymond Pearl, indicated that smoking was connected with the shortening of lifespan. And then in 1950, Hill and Dahl in the UK and Widener and Graham in the US show a statistically significant correlation between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And this is a link that we take for granted in the modern world in 2025, but this is a pretty big moment in 1950 that these four researchers are for the first time conclusively proving and demonstrating a link that we now take for granted and accept as fact. And in the 1990s, China becomes the largest manufacturer and consumer of cigarettes, and there are 300 million smokers consuming 40% of the global cigarette production. And in 2003, Hanlick, the Chinese pharmacist and inventor, develops the e-cigarette, a smokeless, pure nicotine smoking device with reduced carcinogenic agents. And it is this vape device, e-cigarette device, that will be the topic of our next 8 learning videos. So now I'm going to conclude with a little bit of a quiz for you all. So the questions are, where did the tobacco plant originate from? Why do we need to study Christopher Columbus to study tobacco? The first U.S. tobacco company, what was it? Why is James Bonsack important in the history of smoking? And what did U.S. biostatistician Raymond Pearl discover? There are 5 answer choices for each one. Take 2 minutes to think about your answers and maybe jot them down. I'll give you the opportunity to pause the video here to do that. Okay, everyone, I hope you guys all had the opportunity to pause the video and attempt the questions. Now let's take a look at the answers. So the tobacco plant originated from E, Haiti. We need to study Christopher Columbus to study tobacco because C, he introduced it to Europe. The first U.S. tobacco company was C, Lorillard. James Bonsack is important in the history of smoking because B, he invented the cigarette machine. And Raymond Pearl discovered B, that smokers have a shorter lifespan. If you answered 3 out of these 5 questions correctly, thank you so much for listening to me over these past 5 minutes, and we can move on to the next mini story. Thank you so much, everyone.